The summer of 1952 brought more than drought to Clearwater Junction, Montana. It brought a stranger whose silence spoke louder than any words, and a woman whose careless tongue would seal both their fates. Margaret O'Brien had always prided herself on knowing everyone's business in their small railroad town. She could tell you which rancher was behind on his mortgage, which widow was sweet on the new preacher, and exactly how many drinks it took for old Pete to start singing Irish ballads at Murphy's Saloon. But when the tall man with the weathered hand stepped off the 347 eastbound train that Tuesday afternoon, carrying nothing but a worn leather satchel and eyes that seemed to see everything while revealing nothing, Margaret made her first and final mistake. She assumed he was just another drifter. She had no way of knowing that Joseph Standing Bear had earned his reputation the hard way, carved it out with precision and patience in places where mercy was a luxury few could afford. She couldn't see the invisible weight he carried, the careful way he observed every face, every doorway, every potential threat in their sleepy little town. And she certainly couldn't have predicted that her thoughtless words to a stranger would trigger a chain of events that would transform Clearwater Junction from a forgettable stop on the Great Northern Railway into a legend whispered in saloons from Billings to Seattle. Some stories are born from love, others from hate. But this story was born from something far more dangerous: misunderstanding between two people who had more in common than either could ever imagine. In a place where the wrong word at the wrong moment could mean the difference between walking away and being carried out. In Clearwater Junction, 1952, everybody knew the unwritten rules. Mind your own business. Keep your opinions to yourself. And if a stranger comes to town, you treat them with cautious respect until you know exactly who they are and why they're there. Margaret O'Brien was about to learn why those rules existed in the first place. The train wheezed to a stop at Clearwater Junction, with the reluctant sigh of old machinery pushed too hard for too long. Steam hissed from beneath the massive engine as Joseph Standing Bear stepped down onto the wooden platform, his boots making barely a sound despite their worn leather construction. He paused for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the harsh Montana sunlight that painted everything in shades of gold and amber. The town spread out before him like a child's toy set, neat and orderly, and somehow smaller than he had expected. Main Street ran straight as an arrow from the railroad tracks to the distant mountains, lined with the typical collection of frontier buildings that seemed to sprout from the earth wherever the railroad decided to stop. A general store with a crooked sign, a saloon with batwing doors that had seen better decades, a bank that tried to look more important than it was, and scattered between them the various shops and services that kept a community of 800 souls fed, clothed, and reasonably content. Joseph shifted his leather satchel to his other hand and began walking towards town. Behind him, the train crew worked with practiced efficiency to load and unload cargo, their voices carrying across the afternoon air like distant music. A few passengers had disembarked with him, but they moved with the purposeful stride of people who belonged here, who had family waiting or business to conduct. Joseph walked differently, with the measured pace of a man who was in no hurry because he had nowhere specific to be. He had learned long ago that the first few minutes in a new place were crucial. People formed their opinions quickly, especially in small towns where strangers were notable events. Too eager, and they would think you were running from something. Too casual, and they might assume you were running towards trouble. The trick was to appear unremarkable while missing nothing, to blend in while staying alert. As he walked down Main Street, Joseph catalogued details with the automatic precision of a man whose survival had often depended on noticing what others missed. The barber shop had fresh white paint, but the chairs visible through the window were old and worn. The hotel looked respectable enough, with clean windows and a recently swept front porch. Murphy's Saloon showed signs of recent repairs to the front doors, suggesting either an enthusiastic celebration or an enthusiastic disagreement in the recent past. But it was the people who drew his closest attention. The elderly man sweeping the front steps of the hardware store moved with the careful deliberation of arthritis, but kept glancing up and down the street with the alertness of a lifelong resident keeping watch over his territory. Two women stood outside the millinery shop, their conversation dying as Joseph passed and resuming in urgent whispers after he had moved beyond earshot. A group of ranch hands lounged outside the saloon, their postures relaxed but their eyes following his progress with the casual interest of men who had little to occupy their time. None of this was unusual. Joseph had walked down dozens of similar streets in dozens of similar towns, and the reactions were always the same. Curiosity tempered by caution, interest mixed with suspicion. Small towns were like living organisms, and strangers were foreign bodies that the community needed to identify and either accept or reject. He found lodging at the Clearwater Hotel, a 3-storied brick building that managed to look both solid and tired at the same time. The desk clerk, a nervous young man with premature gray at his temples, took Joseph's money and asked no questions beyond those required by the registration book. The room was on the second floor, clean and spare, with a view of Main Street that would let him observe the town's rhythms without being obvious about it. That evening, Joseph took his dinner at Murphy's Saloon, choosing a table in the corner where he could watch the room while keeping his back to a solid wall. The food was simple but well prepared. The beer cold and honest. The other patrons gave him the space that strangers were typically afforded. Curious glances but no direct approaches. The bartender, a thick-set man with careful eyes, served him politely, but didn't attempt conversation beyond the necessary pleasantries. It was exactly what Joseph had hoped for and expected. A quiet place where a man could conduct his business without attracting undue attention. Where the locals minded their own affairs and expected others to do the same. He had no way of knowing that his assessment, while accurate for most of the town's residents, overlooked one crucial exception. Margaret O'Brien ran the town's telephone exchange from a small office attached to her boarding house on Elm Street. At 42, she possessed the kind of sharp intelligence that, in a larger city, might have made her a successful businesswoman or journalist. In Clearwater Junction, it made her the unofficial keeper of everyone's secrets and the unofficial distributor of everyone's business. Margaret prided herself on knowing things. She knew that Dr. Henderson had been writing more prescriptions for laudanum than seemed medically necessary. She knew that the banker's wife received letters from Denver that weren't from any relatives. She knew that the railroad supervisor was skimming money from the freight manifests and hiding it in a coffee tin buried behind his house. Knowledge was power. And in a small town, power came from understanding the intricate web of relationships, debts, favors, and secrets that bound the community together. So when word reached her that a stranger had taken a room at the hotel and was asking no questions and offering no explanations, Margaret's curiosity was immediately aroused. Strangers fell into categories. Traveling salesmen, railroad inspectors, land speculators, family members visiting relatives, or men running from something. Joseph's standing bear fit none of these familiar patterns. He had paid for his room in cash, unusual but not unheard of. He had registered under his real name, which suggested he wasn't hiding from the law. He dressed like a working man, but his hands were too soft for ranch work and too clean for railroad labor. He spoke when spoken to, but volunteered nothing about his origins or his business in Clearwater Junction. By the end of his second day in town, Margaret had gathered these facts and found them deeply unsatisfying. She had built her reputation on being able to read people, to categorize them and predict their behavior. Joseph Standing Bear resisted categorization, and that made him dangerous to her sense of order and control. The breaking point came on Thursday afternoon when Margaret encountered Joseph outside the post office. She had been mailing letters for several of her boarding house tenants when she saw him studying the wanted posters that were tacked to the bulletin board beside the front door. Something about his manner, the careful way he examined each poster, triggered an alarm in her mind. "Looking for someone?" she asked, her tone deliberately casual but her eyes sharp with suspicion. Joseph looked at her with the same polite attention he had shown everyone else in town. "Just curious," he said simply. Margaret waited for him to elaborate, to offer some explanation or excuse for his interest in the wanted posters. When he didn't, her suspicion deepened into certainty that he was hiding something significant. "Curious about what?" she pressed. "Whether this is the kind of place where a man can mind his own business," Joseph replied, his voice still calm but with an edge that suggested the conversation was over. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. She was not accustomed to being dismissed, especially not by strangers who had no standing in the community. In her experience, people who refused to answer simple questions usually had something to hide, and people with something to hide were potential threats to the stability and safety of the town. "Most folks around here are friendly enough to answer a simple question," she said, her voice taking on the brittle quality it acquired when she felt challenged. Joseph studied her for a moment with those dark eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. "Most folks around here seem smart enough to know when a question isn't simple," he said quietly. The words hit Margaret like a slap. She had been questioned, categorized, and found wanting by a man who was supposed to be the outsider, the one seeking acceptance. The natural order of things had been reversed, and she felt a sudden urgent need to restore her position of authority and knowledge. "I suppose that depends on what kind of business brings a man to a town like this," she said, her voice rising slightly. "Especially a man who doesn't seem to have any business at all." Joseph's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle straightening that suggested controlled tension. "I suppose it does," he said. Margaret realized that several other people had paused in their activities to listen to the exchange. Mrs. Ware Peterson from the dry goods store was pretending to rearrange items in her window display while obviously straining to hear every word. Two ranch hands had stopped their conversation and turned to watch. Even old Mr. Crawford had paused in his daily journey from the barber shop to the hotel lobby to observe the confrontation. The attention fed Margaret's sense of righteousness. She was defending the community against a potential threat, protecting their way of life against an intruder who refused to observe the basic courtesies that kept small towns functioning. "Well, I hope your business, whatever it is, concludes quickly and satisfactorily," she said with false sweetness. "We're a peaceful community here, and we like to keep it that way." The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Joseph heard it, understood it, and filed it away with all the other information he had gathered about Clearwater Junction. He nodded politely to Margaret and walked away, leaving her standing by the post office with the uncomfortable feeling that she had just made a serious mistake. But Margaret O'Brien was not a woman who admitted mistakes easily. Instead, she told herself that she had done the right thing, that someone needed to let the stranger know that Clearwater Junction was not the kind of place where mysterious men could conduct mysterious business without question. She told herself that she had acted in the best interests of the community, protecting the innocent and maintaining order. What she couldn't tell herself because she had no way of knowing was that Joseph Standing Bear was not in Clearwater Junction by accident. He was there because someone had paid him to be there. Someone who had very specific reasons for wanting a particular problem solved in a particular way. And Margaret's confrontation had just made that problem infinitely more complicated. As evening fell over Clearwater Junction, Joseph sat in his hotel room reviewing everything he had learned about the town and its people. He had come here to complete a job, to settle a debt that had been growing with interest for 3 long years. The plan had been simple: arrive quietly, conduct his business efficiently, and leave without attracting attention. Margaret O'Brien had just made simple impossible. Margaret O'Brien had always believed that knowledge was like water in a drought-stricken landscape. It found its way into every crack and crevice, pooled in the lowest places, and eventually revealed the true shape of the terrain beneath. In the 3 days following her confrontation with the stranger, she set about collecting every drop of information about Joseph Standing Bear that she could gather. Her investigation began, as most of her investigations did, with Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the banker's wife and Margaret's most reliable source of information about the town's financial dealings. Eleanor possessed the unique combination of access to privileged information and an almost pathological need to share it with someone she could trust. Over coffee and store-bought cookies in Margaret's kitchen, Eleanor revealed that Joseph had paid for his hotel room 2 weeks in advance, in cash, using bills that were crisp enough to suggest they had come directly from a bank rather than being carried in a working man's pocket. Harrison thought it was unusual, Eleanor confided, referring to her husband with the familiarity of 20 years of marriage. Most men who pay that far ahead are either expecting to be here longer than they want to admit, or they're planning to leave suddenly and want to avoid questions about unpaid bills. Margaret absorbed this information with the satisfaction of a hunter who had found fresh tracks. 2 weeks suggested that Joseph's business in Clearwater Junction was more complex than a simple overnight stay. But why pay in advance unless he was concerned about his ability to pay later? Was he expecting trouble, or was he planning to create it? Her next stop was Murphy's Saloon, where she knew that Tom Murphy kept his ears open and his mouth carefully controlled. Tom had been running the saloon for 15 years, and in that time he had learned that bartenders who gossiped too freely soon found themselves without customers who trusted them with their secrets. But Margaret had known Tom since they were children, and she understood how to approach him in a way that encouraged information sharing without making him feel like he was betraying a confidence. "That new fellow seems quiet enough," she said casually, settling onto a bar stool during the afternoon lull when the saloon was empty except for 2 old-timers playing checkers in the corner. Tom wiped down a glass with mechanical precision, his expression neutral. "Quiet men usually have their reasons," he replied. "Reasons can be good or bad," Margaret observed. "Usually are," Tom agreed. He set down the glass and picked up another. His movements deliberate and unhurried. Pays his tab in cash, doesn't start conversations, doesn't finish them either if someone else starts them. Orders beer and drinks it slow. Watches the room but doesn't stare. Could be a lot worse. Margaret recognized the diplomatic language of a man who was sharing information without appearing to gossip. Tom's assessment suggested that Joseph was professional in his behavior, careful in his observations, and disciplined in his habits. These were not the characteristics of a drifter or a petty criminal. They were the characteristics of someone with training. someone who understood the importance of blending in while staying alert. "Any idea what brings him to town?" she asked. Tom's hands paused for just a moment in their glass-cleaning routine. "Hasn't said. Haven't asked." The pause told Margaret more than the words. Tom knew something, or suspected something, that he wasn't sharing. In 15 years of running a saloon, Tom had developed an instinct for recognizing different types of dangerous men. His careful neutrality suggested that he had categorized Joseph as someone to treat with respect and caution. Margaret's investigation continued throughout the week. She spoke with the hotel desk clerk, who confirmed that Joseph kept regular hours and received no mail or visitors. She questioned the proprietor of the general store, who reported that Joseph had purchased basic supplies including soap, razor blades, and a small notebook, but nothing that suggested either permanence or preparation for travel. She even managed to strike up a conversation with the railway station master, who remembered Joseph's arrival but could add nothing about his origins or destination. Each piece of information was small and seemingly insignificant, but together they created a picture that both frustrated and alarmed Margaret. Joseph Standing Bear was behaving exactly like a man who wanted to avoid attention while accomplishing some unstated purpose. He was methodical, patient, and careful. Most troubling of all, he was completely self-contained, neither seeking information from the townspeople nor offering any information about himself. In Margaret's experience, men who were that controlled usually had something significant to hide. Meanwhile, Joseph was conducting his own investigation, though his methods were more subtle and his objectives more specific. He had come to Clearwater Junction with a name and an address, information that had cost him considerable time and money to obtain. But knowing where to find someone and actually finding them were two different problems, especially when that someone had spent 3 years being very careful not to be found. Daniel McCready had been many things during his 38 years of life. A soldier, a gambler, a sometime rancher, and a full-time survivor. He had also been, for 6 months in the winter of 1949, the leader of a group of men who had robbed trains, banks, and stagecoaches across 3 states before disappearing with over $40,000 in stolen money. And the blood of 2 innocent people on their hands. One of those innocent people had been Joseph's younger brother. The information that had led Joseph to Clearwater Junction was 3 years old and came from a dying man who had once ridden with McCready's gang. According to that information, McCready had come to Montana under the name Daniel Reed, purchased a small ranch outside town, and settled down to live quietly on his share of the stolen money. The description matched: average height, brown hair, scar on his left hand from a knife fight in Colorado, and a distinctive way of favoring his right leg due to an old bullet wound. Joseph had seen a man matching that description twice during his first week in town, once outside the bank, once coming out of the hardware store. Both times at a distance, both times briefly, but both times long enough to notice the favored right leg and the careful way the man observed his surroundings before moving from one location to another. The problem was verification. 3 years was long enough for a man to change considerably, especially if he was trying to become someone else. Joseph needed to be absolutely certain before he acted, because once he acted, there would be no opportunity to correct a mistake. So he waited and watched and gradually pieced together the routines and relationships that governed life in Clearwater Junction. He learned that Daniel Reed, if that was indeed McCready, owned a small ranch about 5 miles outside town and came into Clearwater Junction every few days for supplies and occasional socializing. He was known as a quiet, reliable neighbor who paid his bills promptly and kept to himself. He had no obvious enemies and no close friends, the kind of man who was present in the community without being part of it. The perfect disguise for someone who wanted to disappear. But Joseph's careful surveillance had not gone completely unnoticed. Margaret O'Brien possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when the normal rhythms of her town were being disrupted, and she had begun to notice that the stranger was asking questions without seeming to ask questions, gathering information without appearing to seek it. She observed him studying people's faces when they mentioned certain names. She noticed the way his attention sharpened when conversations turned to topics involving local ranchers or recent arrivals to the area. Most tellingly, she saw him make careful note of who came and went from the various businesses, as if he was mapping the social geography of the town. Margaret's suspicions crystallized into certainty on the following Tuesday morning, when she witnessed Joseph's reaction to seeing Daniel Reed. She was walking past the hotel when Reed's wagon pulled up in front of the bank. Joseph happened to be sitting on the hotel porch, apparently reading a 3-day-old newspaper. But Margaret saw his posture change subtly when Reed climbed down from the wagon. The casual observer would have noticed nothing. Joseph continued reading his newspaper, showed no obvious signs of interest or recognition. But Margaret had spent 42 years studying people, and she recognized the difference between genuine indifference and carefully controlled attention. Joseph was watching Daniel Reed with the focused intensity of a predator observing potential prey. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Joseph Standing Bear had not come to Clearwater Junction by accident or coincidence. He had come looking for someone specific. And that someone was Daniel Reed. Margaret didn't know why Joseph was interested in Reed, but she was certain that the interest was not benign. Her mind raced through possibilities. Was Joseph a law enforcement officer conducting an investigation, a bounty hunter pursuing a fugitive, a criminal seeking revenge? Each possibility seemed equally plausible and equally dangerous for the stability of her community. Margaret made her decision with the same impulsive certainty that had characterized most of the major choices in her life. She would warn Daniel Reed that he was being watched, and she would encourage the stranger to conclude his business in Clearwater Junction as quickly as possible. The town had been peaceful for 3 years, and she was not going to allow an outsider to disrupt that peace without a fight. What Margaret couldn't know, because her investigation had been focused on the present rather than the past, was that Daniel Reed's 3 years of peaceful living had been purchased with blood money and built on the foundation of other people's suffering. She couldn't know that Joseph Standing Bear's interest in Reed was not criminal but personal, not motivated by greed, but by a debt of honor that had consumed 3 years of his life. Most importantly, she couldn't know that her decision to intervene would transform a carefully planned confrontation between two men into a crisis that would engulf the entire town. That afternoon, while Joseph was conducting his own careful surveillance, Margaret walked the 5 miles to Daniel Reed's ranch. The exercise gave her time to think, to plan her approach, and to convince herself that she was acting in the best interests of everyone involved. Reed's ranch was exactly what she had expected: modest but well-maintained, prosperous without being ostentatious. The house was small but solid, the barn and corrals were in good repair, and the cattle that grazed in the nearby pasture looked healthy and well-fed. It was the home of a man who worked hard, lived simply, and asked nothing from his neighbors except to be left alone. Reed himself answered her knock, and Margaret was struck by how normal he appeared. Medium height, brown hair starting to grey at the temples, weathered hands that spoke of honest labor, and clear blue eyes that showed surprise but no fear at her unexpected visit. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said, his voice carrying the slight accent that marked him as someone who had come to Montana from elsewhere. "This is unexpected. Please, come in." The interior of the house reinforced Margaret's impression of honest prosperity. The furniture was simple but well made, the floors were clean, and the few decorations suggested a man who appreciated beauty but didn't indulge in excess. A small shelf held a handful of books, mostly technical manuals related to ranching and animal husbandry. The kitchen was organized with the precision of someone who lived alone but maintained standards. "I apologize for arriving unannounced," Margaret said, accepting the chair that Reed offered. "But I felt it was important to speak with you about a matter that concerns the entire community." Reed poured coffee from a pot that had been warming on the stove and settled into the chair across from her. His manner was attentive but relaxed, the behavior of a man who had nothing to hide and no reason to fear unexpected visitors. "I'm listening," he said simply. Margaret chose her words carefully, wanting to convey the seriousness of the situation without revealing how much she had been investigating Joseph's activities. "We have a stranger in town," she began. "A man who arrived last week and has been asking questions, watching people, gathering information about local residents." Reed's expression didn't change, but Margaret thought she detected a subtle shift in his posture, a slight tensing that suggested increased alertness.
"What kind of questions?" he asked.
"The indirect kind," Margaret replied. "The kind that don't seem like questions unless you know what to look for. But I've been watching him, and I'm convinced that he's here looking for someone specific." She paused, studying Reed's face for any sign of recognition or fear. What she saw was puzzlement mixed with concern, the reaction of a man who was trying to understand why someone might be asking questions about him. "And you think that someone might be me," Reed said. "It wasn't a question. I think it's possible," Margaret replied. "I don't know why, and I don't know what his intentions are. But I thought you should be aware of the situation." Reed was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions he hadn't known he needed to ask. When he looked up, his expression was troubled but determined. "I appreciate the warning," he said. "Can you describe this man?"
Margaret provided a detailed description of Joseph,
including his mannerisms, his habits, and her assessment of his character. As she spoke, she watched Reed's face carefully, looking for signs of recognition or understanding. What she saw instead was confusion, as if Reed was trying to place someone he couldn't quite remember. "The name Joseph Standing Bear doesn't mean anything to you?" she asked. Reed shook his head slowly. "Nothing comes to mind, but that doesn't mean he doesn't know me. I've moved around quite a bit over the years, met a lot of people in a lot of different circumstances." It was a reasonable explanation, and Reed's manner supported his claim of innocence. But Margaret had lived long enough to know that appearances could be deceiving, and that reasonable explanations sometimes concealed unreasonable truths. "What will you do?" she asked. Reed stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his ranch with the expression of a man who is seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time in months. "I suppose I'll have to go into town and introduce myself," he said finally. "Find out what this fellow wants and see if we can resolve whatever misunderstanding might exist." Margaret felt a chill of premonition. She had come to the ranch hoping to prevent a confrontation, but she had succeeded only in accelerating one. Reed's decision to seek out Joseph directly was exactly the opposite of what she had intended to accomplish. "Perhaps it would be better to wait," she suggested. "See if he leaves town on his own." Reed turned from the window and looked at her with eyes that suddenly seemed much older than his years. "Mrs. O'Brien," he said quietly, "I've spent 3 years building a life here. I've worked hard, paid my debts, and tried to be a good neighbor. If someone has come looking for me, then waiting won't solve anything. It will only postpone whatever reckoning is coming." Margaret left the ranch that afternoon with the uncomfortable certainty that she had set in motion events that were beyond her ability to control. She had wanted to protect her community from disruption, but she had succeeded only in ensuring that the disruption would be more dramatic and potentially more dangerous than anything that might have occurred naturally. As she walked back toward town, Margaret tried to convince herself that she had done the right thing. That warning Reed had been the action of a responsible citizen looking out for her neighbor's welfare. But a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she had just ensured that 2 men who might otherwise have resolved their differences quietly would now confront each other publicly. With the entire town watching, and the potential for violence hanging over them, like a storm cloud building on the horizon. That evening, as Margaret sat in her boarding house kitchen trying to concentrate on her account books, she found herself listening for the sound of gunshots from the direction of town. The next morning brought one of those crystalline Montana days, when the air was so clear that the mountains seemed close enough to touch, and every sound carried with unusual sharpness. Joseph Standing Bear woke before dawn, as was his habit, and spent the early hours reviewing everything he had learned about Daniel McCready's new life as Daniel Reed. The man owned a modest ranch 5 miles outside town, ran a small herd of cattle, and had established himself as a reliable, if solitary member of the community. He paid his bills promptly, caused no trouble, and asked nothing from his neighbors except to be left alone. On the surface, it was exactly the kind of life that a man might build if he wanted to disappear from his past and start fresh. But Joseph had learned to distrust surfaces. In his experience, the most dangerous men were often those who appeared most ordinary, who had perfected the art of blending into their surroundings while maintaining their essential nature beneath a carefully constructed facade. He dressed carefully that morning, choosing his clothes with the same attention he had once given to selecting weapons. Dark trousers, white shirt, brown vest, and a jacket that was well-tailored, but not expensive. The kind of outfit that would allow him to move through the town without attracting attention while maintaining the dignity that the situation demanded. As he made his final preparations, Joseph reflected on the 3-year journey that had brought him to this moment. The months of following cold trails through half a dozen states, the weeks spent in archives and newspaper morgues, researching crimes and criminals, the countless conversations with lawmen, witnesses, and former associates who might have information about McCready's whereabouts. The investigation had consumed his savings, his relationships, and nearly his sanity. There had been times when he had considered abandoning the pursuit, accepting that some debts could never be collected and some wrongs could never be righted. But each time, he had been ready to quit. He had remembered his brother's face, remembered the promise he had made at the graveside, and found the strength to continue. Now, finally, he was within reach of the man who had killed Thomas Standing Bear during a bank robbery in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The plan was simple: confirm McCready's identity, confront him with the evidence of his crimes, and give him the choice between surrendering to the authorities or facing the consequences of his actions in a more immediate fashion. Joseph preferred the law, but he was prepared for either outcome. What he had not anticipated was that his careful surveillance would be detected and reported, that Daniel Reed would learn of his presence before Joseph was ready to reveal himself. As he walked down Main Street toward Murphy's saloon, where he planned to take his breakfast, Joseph noticed the subtle changes in the town's atmosphere that suggested significant news was being discussed and disseminated. Conversations stopped when he passed, then resumed in urgent whispers. People who had previously ignored him now watched his movements with obvious interest. The postmaster, who had nodded politely during their previous encounters, now studied him with the intensity of a man trying to solve a particularly challenging puzzle. Someone had been talking. Someone had connected Joseph to Daniel Reed and shared that information with enough people to transform his presence from a minor curiosity into a major topic of discussion. The careful anonymity that had been essential to his plan was disappearing like morning mist in the rising sun. Joseph considered his options as he entered the saloon. He could abandon the confrontation, leave town immediately, and hope to track McCready to a new location where his investigation could begin again. He could accelerate his timeline, seek out McCready immediately before the man had time to prepare defenses or plan an escape, or he could proceed with his original plan, accepting that the element of surprise was lost, but trusting that 3 years of preparation would be sufficient to achieve his objectives regardless of the circumstances. The decision was made for him when Daniel Reed walked through the saloon's front door. Joseph recognized him immediately, even though 3 years and the soft living of a successful rancher had changed his appearance considerably. The man was heavier now, his face less gaunt, his hair longer and better groomed. But the scar on his left hand was exactly as described. The slight favor of his right leg was unchanged, and there was something in his eyes, a particular quality of alertness and calculation, that marked him unmistakably as the man who had once led a gang of killers and thieves across 3 states. Reed approached Joseph's table with the direct stride of a man who had made a decision and intended to follow through with it, regardless of the consequences. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough for conversation, but far enough to avoid seeming aggressive, and looked down at Joseph with an expression that mixed curiosity, wariness, and something that might have been resignation. "You must be Joseph Standing Bear," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet saloon. Joseph set down his coffee cup with deliberate care and looked up at the man he had been hunting for 3 years.
"And you must be Daniel McCready." The use of his real name hit Reed like a physical blow.
Joseph saw him stiffen, saw his hand move instinctively toward his hip where a gun belt would have hung in the old days, saw the quick calculation in his eyes as he assessed the situation and his options. "That name doesn't mean anything to me," Reed said, but his voice lacked conviction. "It means something to me," Joseph replied quietly. "It means the name of the man who killed my brother in Cheyenne 3 years ago." The silence in the saloon became absolute. Even the old-timers at their eternal checkers game had stopped pretending not to listen. Tom Murphy stood behind the bar like a statue, his hand resting on the club he kept for dealing with troublemakers, his eyes moving between the 2 men as he tried to assess the likelihood of violence erupting in his establishment. Reed's face went through a series of subtle changes as he processed Joseph's accusation and its implications. Surprise, recognition, calculation, and finally a kind of weary acceptance that suggested he had always known this moment would come. "I think you've mistaken me for someone else," he said, but even as he spoke the words, his posture was shifting, his weight moving to the balls of his feet, his body preparing for action. "Thomas Standing Bear," Joseph said, his voice steady, but carrying an edge that made several patrons quietly move toward the exits. 23 years old, shot down in front of the Cattleman's Bank in Cheyenne on March 15, 1849. He was walking to work. Wrong place, wrong time, but you killed him just the same. Reed's facade finally cracked completely. The careful persona of Daniel Reed, respectable rancher and solid citizen, fell away to reveal the hard, dangerous man beneath. His eyes went flat and cold, his mouth tightened into a thin line, and his entire demeanor shifted from defensive to predatory. "Proving something like that would be difficult after 3 years," he said, his voice now carrying the confidence of a man who had talked his way out of trouble many times before. "I'm not interested in proving anything," Joseph replied. "I'm interested in settling a debt." The word debt hung in the air between them like a challenge. In the frontier code that still governed much of Montana territory, debts of honor were serious matters that demanded serious resolution. Everyone in the saloon understood that they were witnessing something more significant than a simple disagreement between strangers. Reed glanced around the room, taking note of the exits, the potential witnesses, the likelihood that local law enforcement would intervene quickly if violence erupted. Joseph could see him calculating odds, weighing options, trying to find a way out of the situation that didn't involve either surrender or gunplay. "Suppose, for the sake of argument, that you've found the right man," Reed said carefully. "What exactly did you have in mind for settling this debt?" It was an admission disguised as a hypothetical question, and everyone in the saloon recognized it as such. Reed was no longer denying his identity, merely negotiating the terms of whatever resolution Joseph had in mind. Joseph stood up slowly, his movements deliberate and unthreatening, but somehow carrying an undercurrent of controlled violence that made the remaining patrons edge even farther away. "I had in mind giving you the choice that you didn't give my brother," he said. "You can come with me to the sheriff's office and surrender yourself for trial, or you can settle this matter between the two of us, here and now." Reed's laugh was short and bitter. "You think the sheriff in this town is going to take the word of a stranger against one of his own citizens? You think a court is going to convict me based on 3-year-old accusations with no evidence except your say-so?" Joseph had considered these problems extensively during his 3-year pursuit. Reed was right that the legal system offered no guarantee of justice, especially for crimes committed in another territory, by a man who had since established himself as a respectable citizen under a new identity. "Then I guess we settle it between ourselves," Joseph said simply. The challenge was explicit now, unavoidable. Reed could accept it and face Joseph in what amounted to a formal duel, or he could refuse and live forever with the knowledge that he had backed down from a confrontation with the brother of one of his victims. But Reed had not survived 6 months as an outlaw leader and 3 years as a fugitive by making reckless decisions. His mind was working furiously, seeking alternatives to the stark choice Joseph had presented. "Or," Reed said slowly, "we could walk away from each other and pretend this conversation never happened."
Could we? Joseph asked.
"Could you really go back to your ranch and your cattle and your quiet life, knowing that I know who you are and what you've done? Could you sleep at night wondering when I might come calling again, or whether I might decide to share your story with the territorial marshal?" Reed's face darkened as he realized the trap he was in. Joseph's pursuit had already destroyed his carefully constructed anonymity. Even if they walked away from each other now, Reed would never again have the security of his assumed identity. He would spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder, waiting for the past to catch up with him. "You son of a bitch," Reed said quietly. "You planned this whole thing, didn't you? You didn't come here for justice. You came here for revenge." "I came here for my brother," Joseph replied. "Call it whatever you want." The distinction was important to Joseph, though he doubted anyone else in the room would understand the difference. Justice implied impartial application of established law, a dispassionate weighing of evidence and punishment. Revenge was personal, emotional, driven by anger and loss rather than principle. But what Joseph sought was neither justice nor revenge. It was resolution, the completion of a debt that had been accumulating interest for 3 years. His brother's death had created an imbalance in the world, a wrong that demanded to be righted according to the oldest and most fundamental laws of human society. Reed stared at him for a long moment, his eyes reflecting the calculations of a man who understood that his options had been reduced to a very simple choice. "When?" he asked. "Now," Joseph said. "Here." Reed glanced around the saloon one more time, noting the terrified faces of the patrons, the nervous tension of the bartender, the profound silence that had settled over the room like a blanket. "Not here," he said finally. "There are innocent people here. If you want to settle this thing between us, we do it somewhere private." Joseph nodded, recognizing the wisdom of the suggestion. Whatever was going to happen between them, it didn't need to endanger bystanders or traumatize witnesses. "The street," he said. 5 minutes. Reed turned and walked toward the front door without another word. Joseph watched him go, then followed at a distance that maintained the formalities while ensuring that Reed didn't have the opportunity to disappear or prepare an ambush. Outside, word of the confrontation had already spread with the lightning speed that characterized news in small towns. People were gathering on both sides of Main Street, some drawn by curiosity, others by the same morbid fascination that attracted crowds to public executions. Margaret O'Brien stood in front of her boarding house, her face pale with the realization that her interference had precipitated exactly the kind of violence she had hoped to prevent. Joseph and Reed faced each other in the middle of Main Street, 20 paces apart, with half the town watching from doorways and windows. The morning sun cast their shadows long across the dirt, and the only sound was the whisper of wind through the buildings and the distant lowing of cattle from the stockyards. Neither man was wearing a gun belt, but Joseph knew that Reed would be armed. Men like McCready didn't survive by going unarmed, even during periods of peaceful respectability. The question was whether Reed would choose to fight with whatever weapon he was carrying, or whether he would attempt some other resolution to their confrontation. Joseph was prepared for either possibility. He had not come to Clearwater Junction to murder a man in the street, but he had come prepared to do whatever was necessary to settle his brother's debt. 3 years of planning and pursuit had brought him to this moment, and he was not going to allow Daniel McCready to escape justice once again. The confrontation that Margaret O'Brien's interference had precipitated was about to begin. The two men stood in the middle of Main Street like actors on a stage, with the entire town of Clearwater Junction serving as their unwilling audience. The morning sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows and warming the air just enough to make the sweat visible on both men's faces, despite the cool temperature. Joseph kept his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture alert but non-threatening. He had learned long ago that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was often the instant before violence erupted, when fear and adrenaline could transform careful planning into chaos. Reed stood 20 paces away, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet, his right hand hovering near the concealed weapon that Joseph was certain he carried.
"You want the truth about your brother?" Reed called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still air.
The whole truth? Joseph said nothing, but his slight nod indicated that he was listening. Thomas Standing Bear wasn't just some innocent bystander who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, Reed continued. He was there because he was supposed to be there. He was working with us. The words hit Joseph like physical blows, each one designed to wound and confuse. He had spent 3 years constructing a narrative of his brother's innocence, building his entire quest for vengeance on the foundation of Thomas's status as an undeserving victim. Reed's accusation threatened to destroy that foundation completely. "You're lying," Joseph said, but even as he spoke, he felt the first stirrings of doubt. "Am I?" Reed's smile was cold and knowing. Think about it. How did we know exactly when the bank would have the most cash on hand? How did we know which guard would be on duty that day? How did we know about the new safe and the combination that opened it? Joseph's mind raced backward through the memories he had accumulated about the robbery, the details he had gleaned from newspaper accounts and witness statements. The gang had indeed displayed an unusual level of knowledge about the bank's operations, more than could be explained by simple observation or luck. "We had inside information," Reed continued, "and your brother was the one providing it." "Thomas worked for the railroad," Joseph said, grasping for the familiar facts that had anchored his understanding of events. He had nothing to do with the bank. Thomas worked for the railroad? Yes, Reed agreed. But he also owed gambling debts to some very unforgiving people. We offered him a way out, help us with one job, and his debts would be forgiven. All he had to do was find out about the bank's procedures and schedules. Margaret O'Brien, watching from her position across the street, felt her stomach clench with the realization that she was witnessing the systematic destruction of everything Joseph Standing Bear believed about his brother and his mission. She had intervened to prevent violence, but she had succeeded only in ensuring that the violence would be accompanied by revelations that might prove more destructive than any physical wound. Joseph struggled to process Reed's accusations while maintaining his focus on the immediate danger. Even if Reed was telling the truth about Thomas's involvement, it didn't excuse murder. Criminals had betrayed their associates since the beginning of crime, but that betrayal typically resulted in exile or imprisonment, not execution. Even if that's true, Joseph said, it doesn't explain why you killed him. Reed's expression darkened with what appeared to be genuine anger. I didn't want to kill him. None of us wanted to kill anyone. That was supposed to be a simple robbery, in and out with no violence. But your brother got cold feet at the last moment. The story that Reed told was different from any version Joseph had heard in 3 years of investigation. According to Reed, Thomas had agreed to provide information about the bank, but had become increasingly nervous as the date of the robbery approached. On the morning of the crime, he had attempted to warn the bank employees about the planned robbery. He was standing in front of the bank when we arrived, Reed said. Not walking to work, not just passing by. He was there to meet with the bank president and tell him everything. He was going to betray us to save his own conscience. Joseph felt the world shifting beneath his feet. If Reed was telling the truth, then Thomas had not been an innocent victim, but a willing participant who had tried to back out of a criminal conspiracy. The noble quest for justice that had consumed 3 years of Joseph's life was revealed as something far more complex and morally ambiguous. You still had no right to kill him, Joseph said, but his voice lacked the conviction that had carried him through 3 years of pursuit. Right? Reed laughed bitterly. What right did he have to get us all hanged? What right did he have to take our money and then try to destroy us when his conscience started bothering him? The argument was compelling in its way, Joseph had to admit. Criminal organizations operated by their own codes of honor and justice, and betrayal was traditionally punished by death. If Thomas had indeed taken money from the gang and then attempted to betray them to the authorities, His killing might be seen as justified within that context. But Joseph had not spent 3 years hunting Daniel McCready based on criminal codes of justice. He had pursued him based on the simpler principle that Thomas Standing Bear had been his brother, and brothers protected each other even after death. "It doesn't matter what he did," Joseph said finally. "It doesn't matter why you killed him. He was my brother, and I made him a promise." Reed nodded as if he had expected that response. "I figured that's what it would come down to. Family honor, blood debt, all that noble nonsense." "Not nonsense," Joseph replied. "The only thing that matters." The two men stared at each other across the 20 paces of dusty street, each understanding that words had carried them as far as words could go. The revelations about Thomas's involvement had changed the moral landscape of their confrontation, but it had not changed the fundamental reality that one brother's debt to another could only be settled in blood. Reed's hand moved slowly towards his jacket, a motion so gradual that it was almost imperceptible. Joseph tensed, preparing to respond to whatever weapon Reed was about to produce. Around them, the watching crowd held its collective breath, sensing that the moment of violence was finally arriving. But instead of a gun, Reed withdrew a folded piece of paper from his inside pocket. "There's something else you need to know," he said, holding up the paper. "Something that changes everything." Joseph's eyes never left Reed's hands, watching for any sign of deception or misdirection. The paper could be a distraction, a way of lowering Joseph's guard before Reed produced his real weapon. "Thomas didn't just provide information about the bank," Reed continued. "He also left something behind, a letter, explaining his actions and asking for forgiveness." The paper fluttered slightly in the morning breeze as Reed held it extended toward Joseph. "He wrote this the night before the robbery. He knew he was going to try to stop us, and he knew what the consequences might be. He wanted someone to understand his reasons." Joseph felt his resolve wavering for the first time in 3 years. The letter, if it was genuine, might contain his brother's final thoughts, his explanation for actions that had led to his death, and Joseph's long pursuit of vengeance. "How do I know it's real?" Joseph asked. "You'll recognize his handwriting," Reed said simply, "and you'll recognize the things he says about you." The offer hung between them like a challenge. Joseph could maintain his focus on the confrontation, reject any attempt at manipulation, and proceed with the resolution he had planned. Or he could allow his curiosity about his brother's final thoughts to override his caution and create an opportunity for Reed to escape or attack. "Toss it here," Joseph said, choosing a middle course that might satisfy his curiosity without completely abandoning his vigilance. Reed flipped the folded paper underhand, sending it fluttering through the air to land in the dust halfway between them. Joseph moved carefully to retrieve it, never taking his eyes completely off Reed, aware that the other man might use this moment of divided attention to launch an attack. The paper was indeed covered with Thomas's familiar handwriting, the same careful script that Joseph remembered from letters home during Thomas's travels. The content was even more devastating than Reed's verbal revelations had been. Thomas had written about his gambling debts, about his desperation when the creditors had threatened violence if he didn't pay. He had described his initial agreement to help the gang as a temporary solution to an impossible problem, never intending for anyone to be hurt. But as the date of the robbery had approached, he had realized that he could not live with the consequences of his actions. "I know this will probably get me killed," Thomas had written in his careful script, "but I can't let innocent people suffer for my weakness." Joseph always said that a man had to live with the consequences of his choices, and I'm finally ready to accept the consequences of mine. The letter went on to describe Thomas's love for his brother, his regret for the shame his actions would bring to the family name, and his hope that Joseph would understand and forgive him for the choices he had made. Joseph read the letter twice, his hands trembling slightly as the implications sank in. His brother had not been an innocent victim of random violence. He had been a willing participant in a criminal conspiracy who had died trying to do the right thing, but only after doing several wrong things. The moral certainty that had sustained Joseph through 3 years of pursuit crumbled like a house built on sand. He had been seeking justice for a crime that was more complex than he had understood, pursuing a man who might be guilty of murder, but who had also been betrayed by his victim. "Now you know," Reed said quietly. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Joseph looked up from the letter to find Reed watching him with an expression that was neither triumphant nor fearful, but rather tired and resigned. The revelations had changed the dynamic between them, but they had not resolved it. "He was still my brother," Joseph said finally. "Yes," Reed agreed. "And I still killed him." The acknowledgement was simple and direct, carrying no attempt at justification or excuse. Reed was admitting to the act while providing context that complicated any simple assessment of guilt or innocence. Joseph folded the letter carefully and put it in his shirt pocket next to his heart. Whatever Thomas had done, whatever mistakes he had made, he had tried to correct them at the cost of his own life. That attempt at redemption, even if it had come too late, deserved recognition and respect. "What happened after you shot him?" Joseph asked. Reed's face hardened with memory. "Everything went to hell. The bank president started shooting from inside the building. The sheriff showed up with 3 deputies. 2 of my men were killed, and the rest of us barely got away with our lives. We never did get the money from that job. So Thomas's attempt to warn the bank had succeeded, at least partially. His death had not been entirely meaningless if it had prevented the robbery and saved the money that would have been stolen." "Where are the rest of your men now?" Joseph asked. "Dead in prison or disappeared," Reed replied. "I'm the last one left, and until you showed up, I thought I was safe." Joseph considered his options. The letter had changed his understanding of events, but it had not changed his fundamental obligation to his brother's memory. Thomas had made mistakes, but he had also tried to correct them. Reed had killed Thomas, but under circumstances that were more complex than Joseph had originally understood. The crowd around them was growing larger and more restless. Several people were calling for the sheriff, and Joseph could see that their confrontation would soon be interrupted by official intervention. If he was going to act, it had to be soon. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Joseph said, raising his voice so that everyone present could hear him clearly. "Will you come with me to the sheriff's office and surrender yourself for trial?" Reed considered the offer seriously, understanding that Joseph was giving him a final opportunity to resolve their conflict through legal rather than violent means. "On what charges?" Reed asked. "Thomas's death happened 3 years ago in another territory. There are no witnesses left alive, no evidence except your accusations and that letter, which could be interpreted as proving that Thomas was a willing participant in a criminal conspiracy." Reed was right about the legal difficulties, and Joseph knew it. Even if the territorial authorities were willing to pursue the case, the chances of conviction were minimal. "Then I guess we finish this the way it started," Joseph said. But even as he spoke, Joseph realized that the certainty that had brought him to Clearwater Junction was gone, replaced by a complex web of moral ambiguity that made simple justice impossible to achieve. Reed seemed to sense Joseph's uncertainty because his posture relaxed slightly and his hand moved away from his concealed weapon. "Or," Reed said, "we could both walk away and let the dead stay buried." The suggestion hung in the air like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Joseph could accept it, return to his previous life, and try to forget the 3 years he had spent pursuing a justice that might not exist. But he knew he couldn't do that. Thomas was still dead, Reed was still responsible, and the debt was still unpaid, regardless of the complexities that surrounded it. Joseph's hand moved to his own weapon, a decision that would determine not just his own fate, but the fate of everyone watching, and the future of Clearwater Junction itself. Joseph's hand froze halfway to his weapon as a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "That's enough." Sheriff Bill Crawford stepped out from behind the corner of the bank building, his badge glinting in the morning sunlight, and his shotgun held in a position that commanded respect without directly threatening either man. At 62, Crawford had been keeping the peace in Clearwater Junction for over a decade, and he understood that sometimes the best way to prevent violence was to insert authority into the equation before emotions could override reason.
"Sheriff," Reed acknowledged, his voice carefully neutral.
"Daniel." Crawford replied, using the name by which Reed had been known in the community. "Mr. Pass." Standing there, Joseph said nothing, but his hand moved away from his weapon in recognition of the sheriff's presence and authority. Crawford walked slowly into the space between the two men, his movements deliberate and unthreatening but establishing his control over the situation. "Now, I've been listening to this conversation from around the corner," he said, "and it seems to me that we've got ourselves a complicated situation that doesn't have any simple solutions." The crowd that had gathered to watch the confrontation stirred restlessly. Some disappointed that the dramatic violence they had expected was being postponed, others relieved that bloodshed might be avoided entirely. "On the one hand," Crawford continued, "we've got accusations about a 3-year-old killing in another territory, with no witnesses and no evidence except hearsay, and a letter that might or might not be genuine." Joseph started to protest, but Crawford held up a hand to silence him. "On the other hand, we've got 2 men standing in the middle of my street, both armed, both ready to settle their differences with violence, in front of half the town, including women and children." Crawford's assessment of the legal situation was accurate. And both Joseph and Reed knew it. Even if the territorial authorities were willing to pursue charges, the chances of conviction were minimal, especially given the complex circumstances surrounding Thomas's death. "So here's what we're going to do," Crawford said, his voice taking on the tone of a man who was used to having his decisions accepted without argument.
Mr.
"Standing there, you're going to put away whatever weapon you're carrying and walk with me to my office, where we're going to have a long conversation about your accusations and what evidence you might have to support them." Joseph's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. "Daniel," Crawford continued, turning to Reed, "you're going to go home to your ranch and stay there while I sort this mess out. And if you're thinking about running, let me remind you that I know every trail and hideout within 50 miles of here, and I've got friends in every town and settlement who would be happy to keep an eye out for you." Reed's smile was bitter but accepting. "I'm not running, Sheriff. I'm too old and too tired to start over again." Crawford studied both men for a long moment, assessing their willingness to accept his authority and follow his instructions. "Margaret O'Brien," he called out, causing the woman in question to start guiltily. "I want to see you in my office in 1 hour. We need to discuss your role in precipitating this situation." Margaret's face flushed red with embarrassment and indignation, but she nodded her agreement. "Everyone else," Crawford announced to the crowd, "go about your business. The show's over." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, people drifting back to their shops and homes while maintaining the kind of animated conversations that suggested the morning's events would be discussed and analyzed for weeks to come. Joseph and Reed stood facing each other for one final moment, the weight of unresolved history hanging between them like a challenge that would remain forever unanswered. "This isn't finished," Joseph said quietly. "Maybe it is," Reed replied. "Maybe it needs to be." Crawford escorted Joseph to the sheriff's office, a small building that served as both jail and administrative center for law enforcement in Clearwater Junction. The office was spartanly furnished but scrupulously clean, with wanted posters covering one wall and a gun rack holding an assortment of rifles and shotguns. Over the next 2 hours, Joseph told his story in complete detail, from the initial news of his brother's death through his 3 years of investigation to his arrival in Clearwater Junction. He produced the documentation he had accumulated, the witness statements, the newspaper clippings, and the careful notes that tracked McCready's movements across 3 states. Crawford listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly allowing Joseph to present his case in his own way and at his own pace. When Joseph finished, Crawford leaned back in his chair and studied the evidence spread across his desk. "It's a hell of a story," Crawford said finally. "And if even half of it's true, this Daniel McCready was a dangerous man who did terrible things." "Was?" Joseph asked. "Was," Crawford confirmed. "The man I know as Daniel Reed has been living in this community for 3 years without causing any trouble. He pays his bills, helps his neighbors, and minds his own business. Whatever he might have done in the past, he's been a model citizen since he arrived here." Joseph felt frustration rising in his chest. "That doesn't erase what he did to Thomas." "No," Crawford agreed. "It doesn't. But it does complicate the question of what justice looks like in this situation." The sheriff stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the town he had sworn to protect and serve. "Let me ask you something, Mr. Standing Bear. If I were to arrest Daniel Reed today, what do you think would happen to him?" Joseph considered the question seriously. "He'd be tried for murder, maybe," Crawford said, "if the territorial authorities decided to pursue the case. But, more likely, he'd be held for a few days or weeks while they investigated, then released for lack of evidence." And then what? Joseph saw where Crawford was leading the conversation, but he didn't like the destination. Then he'd go back to his ranch and his cattle, and you'd go back to wherever you came from, and nothing would be resolved except that this community would be disrupted and damaged by events they had nothing to do with. Crawford turned from the window to face Joseph directly. "I'm not saying that your brother's death doesn't matter. I'm not saying that Daniel Reed doesn't deserve to face consequences for his actions. But I am saying that sometimes the best justice we can achieve is imperfect justice, and sometimes the cost of perfect justice is too high for the innocent people who get caught in the middle." It was a pragmatic assessment that recognized the limitations of law enforcement in a frontier society where evidence was scarce, witnesses were unreliable, and jurisdictional boundaries complicated the pursuit of justice. Joseph spent the rest of the day walking the streets of Clearwater Junction, observing the town and its people with new eyes. He saw children playing in front of houses where their parents worked to build better lives. He saw storekeepers serving customers who depended on their goods and services. He saw a community that functioned because people trusted each other and cooperated for mutual benefit. The violence he had contemplated would have shattered that trust and cooperation, turning neighbors against neighbors and transforming a peaceful town into a place where people lived in fear and suspicion. That evening, Joseph found himself standing outside Daniel Reed's ranch, having walked the 5 miles from town as the sun set behind the mountains. Reed was sitting on his front porch, apparently unsurprised by Joseph's arrival. "I wondered if you'd come," Reed said, gesturing to an empty chair beside him. Joseph climbed the porch steps and sat down, accepting the unspoken invitation to continue their conversation in a more private setting. "Sheriff Crawford says you've been a model citizen for 3 years," Joseph said. "Sheriff Crawford is a fair man," Reed replied. "I've tried to be worthy of his good opinion." They sat in silence for several minutes, watching the last light fade from the sky and listening to the sounds of cattle settling down for the night. "I can't just walk away," Joseph said finally. "He was my brother." "I know," Reed said, "and I can't change what I did to him. Would you, if you could?" Reed considered the question seriously. "I'd change a lot of things if I could. The whole robbery, Thomas's decision to betray us, my decision to shoot him. But changing the past isn't an option that's available to either of us." Joseph felt the weight of 3 years of pursuit settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. He had come to Clearwater Junction seeking a simple resolution to a complex problem, and instead he had found only more complexity. "What do you think Thomas would want?" Reed asked quietly. It was a question Joseph had been avoiding, but one that demanded consideration. Thomas had tried to do the right thing at the end, even knowing it might cost him his life. Would he want his brother to spend the rest of his life pursuing vengeance? Would he want innocent people to suffer for the sake of abstract justice? "I think," Joseph said slowly, "he'd want me to be better than he was. Make better choices than he made." Reed nodded. "That's what I think too." The conversation continued long into the night, two men who had been enemies working their way towards something that might eventually become understanding, if not forgiveness. By morning, they had reached an agreement. Reed would leave Clearwater Junction permanently, selling his ranch and his cattle and moving to a place where his past would not threaten the peace of an innocent community. He would also sign a confession detailing his role in the bank robbery and Thomas's death, a document that would be held by Sheriff Crawford and forwarded to the territorial authorities for their consideration. In exchange, Joseph would end his pursuit and allow Reed to build a new life elsewhere without the constant threat of violent confrontation. It was not the justice that Joseph had originally sought, but it was perhaps the justice that Thomas would have wanted, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing, consequences for past actions, and an opportunity for redemption through future behavior. Margaret O'Brien, chastened by her role in precipitating the crisis, offered to purchase Reed's ranch at a fair price, with the understanding that it would be resold to a family looking for a new start in Montana Territory. 6 months later, Joseph received a letter from Reed, postmarked in Oregon Territory. Reed had found work as a foreman on a large ranch, was living under his real name for the first time in 3 years, and was using his salary to make anonymous donations to a fund for the families of victims of violent crime. It was not the ending that Joseph had planned, but it was an ending that honored his brother's memory while allowing Reed the possibility of genuine redemption. Joseph returned to his home in Colorado Territory, where he used the skills he had developed during his 3-year investigation to work as a private detective, specializing in finding missing persons and recovering stolen property. He never married, but he built a life that was meaningful and useful, helping other people resolve the kinds of complex problems that the formal legal system couldn't address. Clearwater Junction returned to its peaceful rhythms, though the events of that summer became part of the town's folklore, a story told and retold around winter fires, about the day when justice and mercy met in the middle of Main Street and somehow found a way to coexist. Margaret O'Brien learned to be more careful about interfering in other people's business, though she never entirely lost her curiosity about the lives and secrets of her neighbors. And on quiet evenings when the mountains were purple with sunset and the air was still enough to carry a man's thoughts across great distances, Joseph Standing Bear would sometimes feel his brother's presence and know that the debt between them had finally been settled, not with blood, but with the kind of hard-won wisdom that comes from choosing compassion over vengeance and understanding over judgment. The summer of 1952 had taught Clearwater Junction that sometimes the most dangerous stranger is not the one who comes to town looking for trouble, but the one who comes looking for justice, and discovers that justice, like truth, is more complicated than it appears from a distance. In the end, Margaret O'Brien's careless words had indeed changed everything, but perhaps in ways that were better than what anyone had originally intended or expected.